This is Unger 101, the politics of Roberto Mangabeira Unger. We turn to part 3 of 5, the state of the left. In part 2, we establish that Unger is working at the level of universal politics, questioning fundamental assumptions built into the current arrangement of society, and proposing his own alternative universal political framework. Before we jump into the content of Unger's universal political framework, what Unger calls his political program, let's first examine how Unger views the current state of society, and more specifically, the current state of the standard bearers of change in society, the left. Unger describes what many already feel. The left is lost. It is confused about what its foundational aims are, it lacks a coherent program of reform, and it has not shown itself recently to have the capacity to realize its aims in the world. To Unger, the left has a vague and misplaced foundational aim: greater equality. Though Unger believes this aim is admirable, he argues that it fails to capture the spiritual aim of individuals, which is not to be vaguely more equal, whatever that means, but rather to be empowered, to have our constructive energy equipped, to diminish the distance between the intensity of our longings and the drudgery that can creep into our lives. Those who look at systems in full might demand that a system be more equal, but from the perspective of ourselves as individuals, we simply ask for a society that gives us a shot at realizing our hopes. To put it another way, Unger asks, if we became more equal, but failed to empower the constructive capacities of us all, would we be satisfied? No. Thus, the goal of lessening inequality is simply a useful means to our true foundational aim: to make us bigger, individually and collectively, to confine us less, to empower all of humanity. To Unger, the left's concrete projects are also misplaced. Unger describes how two groups on the left have responded to globalization in its current form, and the neoliberal orthodoxy that is spurring it. The first left, who Unger calls the recalcitrant left, are those who wish to slow down the march to markets and to globalization, often for the purpose of protecting their historical constituency, the organized industrial labor force, who are often harmed by globalization. But this left often offers no positive, forward-thinking alternative to globalization, or idea about how to redirect the forces that are pushing globalization forward. They simply point to globalization's negative effects and shout stop. The second and much more powerful left, who Unger calls the humanizing left, are those who accept the world in its present form, taking the current arrangements of the market economy and globalization as inevitable. And instead of attempting to stop or reimagine neoliberal globalization, they attempt to accept it and humanize it by redistributing wealth through tax and transfer policies such as Social Security or food stamps. Their policy is, yes, markets and globalization leave humanity greatly unequal and disempowered, but we'll make up for it after the fact by skimming some off the top and sending it to the bottom for protection. To Unger, these humanizing programs are much too institutionally conservative. They refuse to address the underlying institutional arrangements that result in our economy being unequal in the first place. In place of innovation in the underlying economic institutions, such as innovating around access to credit, access to education, the legal framework of incorporation, government participation in venture capital, and more, they substitute only after-the-fact alleviation of the system's worst effects. The result is that the promise of these programs, of minimalist social democracy, is not realized. Inequality is not lessened, and there is little social solidarity. Tax and transfer redistribution is the humanizing left's paltry attempt to make up for a failure to achieve any fundamental broadening of opportunity. We sweeten what we no longer know how to rethink and reshape. To Unger, this humanizing left is the grand compromise of neoliberalism. Classical liberalism's greatest problem, hierarchical inequality where some become very rich and others very poor, will be rectified by an institutionally conservative social democracy. Tax and transfer makes sure no one starves. With the recalcitrant left failing to provide an alternative to classical liberalism, and the only other major alternative, government direction of the economy, becoming ever more discredited, the project of the humanizers, minimalist social democracy, becomes the only game in town for the left. Without an alternative, and with radical libertarianism on the rise, the situation becomes even more entrenched, as this rather institutionally conservative project of more redistribution, more regulation, and, as Unger jokes, more Sweden, becomes framed as a far-left ideology, crowding out any real, radical, creative tinkering in the underlying inequalities built into the current system. Finally, even if the left had a clear foundational aim and program to achieve it, Unger worries that the left lacks the capacity to achieve anything because we are missing two ingredients: an agent and a crisis. First, the left is missing an agent. Leftists used to have a base of people to help implement their program, the industrial working class. But the industrial working class is shrinking, and as it shrinks, it becomes less interested in bearing a universal project, and more interested in seeing itself as another special interest. The left, to Unger, needs to supplement the industrial working class with another agent. Second, the left is missing a crisis. As Unger points out, political change is often driven by crises, such as war or economic collapse. Crisis raises the temperature of politics and melts down frozen definitions of interest and identity. For example, our current arrangement was forged in the 1930s and 40s out of the crises of the Great Depression and World War II. But now, leftists don't have a moment to implement their program. And when they have a moment, such as the recent financial crisis, they fail to get their act together. And even if they did, no crisis is large enough for the cause. Unger believes that leftists thus need to find a way to do the work of crisis without crisis. To recap, Unger believes that the left is lost. 1. The left has a vague foundational aim of greater equality, but this aim fails to capture humanity's true aim of empowerment, helping individuals live bigger lives. 2. The left lacks a program. As globalization poses a crisis to the project of the left, we respond by trying to slow globalization down or humanize it through tax and transfer policies. But we fail to put forth a program that intervenes in the underlying institutional arrangements that result in a hierarchical economy in the first place. 3. The left lacks an agent. The industrial working class is no longer sufficient for realizing the left's vision. 4. The left lacks a crisis. We have yet to understand how to bring about change independent of crisis. Now that we have established the level at which Unger's political thought is working, at the universal foundational level, and have established what Unger identifies as the problem, a global orthodoxy of neoliberalism and a left that has been unable to provide an alternative, we can now turn to part 4, Unger's solution, his global heresy, his strong progressive alternative, his political program.